Today I want to talk about human nature, an incredibly important topic that surprisingly gets a lot of debate, and honestly it shouldn't. And not because it's not complex, but because we actually do know a lot about it already. So first, it's important to define what human nature is, or rather what is generally referred to as human nature. There's three so-called natures that are helpful to us when it comes to understanding what we are as humans. We have an animal part, or less than human, but we can call it subpersonal or animal. Then there's a human side, which is our advanced cognitive abilities, and a nature that is above human too. And we can call it the spirit for the sake of simplicity, although I'm really not going to be talking about it in this video. So whenever we find ourselves discussing human nature, what we're really talking about is more like primate nature or human nature at the animal level. And this clarification is important not just for us to be able to distinguish between them, but it is very much historically relevant, as the very reason human nature is denied largely stems from the obsession and fixation on our human aspect, our rational side, which in recent times has led us to formulate entire ideologies, obfuscating, ignoring, or straight up denying our more primal side altogether. So the misunderstanding surrounding human nature is as follows. Animals act on instinct, but humans build civilizations. We create art, develop science, we reflect on morality, we have culture, reason, and free will. So we must really have evolved beyond the primitive drives of other creatures. Human nature is such a controversial topic because many of our deepest instincts conflict with the ideals that we aspire to. We find it uncomfortable to accept that certain primal traits like aggression, greed, tribalism, nepotism, sexual impulse, and more still shape our behavior. These tendencies are not the result of culture or poor upbringing alone, they are embedded in our evolutionary wiring, and yet acknowledging them feels like an admission that progress has limits. That even in a world of reason and civilization, we're still animals beneath the surface. We want to believe that we can overcome our base impulses entirely, just as we've overcome disease, famine, and distance with technology. But the human mind carries its own evolutionary history that is not so easily rewritten. Like, sure, we have advanced reasoning, we can process complex language, and we're capable of abstract thinking and long-term planning. And those are amazing traits, and yes, they do make us more advanced than other animals. But at the end of the day, we're still animals. We're animals plus, animals and more. That's what makes us human. We have animal-level instincts that coexist with a rational side. And, when we're talking about human nature, we're referring to our evolutionary instincts, deep-rooted behaviors and tendencies that we all share. These are universal patterns that cut across race, culture, and geography. Take facial expressions, for example. They're a perfect illustration of shared human nature. A happy face means happy, whether you're in modern-day North America, medieval Europe, 3000 AD Korea, a remote tribe in Papua New Guinea. The facial expressions for anger, joy, sadness, and fear. Our faces speak a universal language, and what's more, we recognize these emotions as children before we even know how to speak. A baby can tell whether their mother is happy or upset just by looking at her face, right? No one has to teach them that. These shared traits point to something deeper, natural predispositions we're all born with, and that makes some people uncomfortable because it challenges the idea that we're blank slates, that everything we are is shaped only by culture or personal lived experiences. But to really understand human nature, we need to understand three key things: how the brain works, how evolution works, and how the brain evolved. If you grasp those, you'll start to see the bigger picture. Okay, so let's talk about evolution for a second. It's pretty straightforward. Imagine a species of prehistoric horses living in an environment full of tall trees. These horses eat the leaves. And now suppose one of them has a random genetic mutation that predisposes its neck to be about 5% longer. That tiny advantage gives it a slightly better access to food, and even though it's not a huge difference, it's enough to make it more likely to survive and reproduce. So over generations, that small advantage is going to accumulate, leading to a new trait and eventually even a new species like giraffes, right? Take gazelles, for example. If one is born genetically predisposed with slightly stronger front legs, with more muscle or with more endurance, and can run, because of this, it can run a little bit faster than its peers. That speed may help it escape predators. And, it's a small edge, but over thousands of generations, it adds up, right? So when we talk about the human body and brain, we're looking at the result of millions of years of these tiny evolutionary pressures stacked over time, selecting for traits that help us survive, thrive, and outcompete others. This is how evolution works. But it doesn't just apply to our bodies. Our brains evolve too, and that's a little bit harder for people to grasp. The size and the shape of our brain, but how our neurons are structured is also highly influenced by our genetics. And this is where the denial comes in, because you have to at least be acquainted with the way our brain works. And that's what we call human nature. It's not just a vague idea or philosophical debate, it's biology shaped over time. Okay, so how does the brain work? Let's talk about the brain for a second. At a basic level, it's made up of billions of neurons, tiny cells that form networks through their connections. And let's say you have a neuron that's connected to your visual system. Your eyes detect light, and the signals from that light are passed as electrical signals through the optic nerve into various neurons in the brain. Some of those neurons activate when there's a high level of brightness, translated into an intense electrical signal. And when you walk into a dark room and suddenly switch on the lights, the change in brightness can trigger reflexive responses like blinking, right? Because those sensory neurons are connected to motor pathways that control your eyelids, for example. That's a basic example of an automatic response shaped by our neural wiring, something deeply rooted in our biology. And the same is true for your sense of smell. If you detect sulfur or feces, specific neurons in your olfactory system activate. And these signals don't just stay in the sensory area of the brain, they also connect to parts of the brain that handle emotion, motor response, and so on, right? For example, if the smell of something rotten might trigger your gag reflex, and that's not conscious, it's a protective evolutionary mechanism, right? These are examples of innate responses, behaviors and reactions triggered by certain inputs. So, and they're pre-configured, but to understand we have to understand how neural networks work. And to help you visualize this, I want you to think about neural networks in artificial intelligence. If you strip away the chemistry, the biological complexity, artificial neural networks are inspired by the real thing and can help us understand this a little bit better. And just like a neural network in artificial intelligence can be trained on patterns to learn, our brains are wired through a kind of biological training process, right? Shaped by evolution and genetics, right? Let's say you're trying to recognize whether you're seeing the number 1 or the number 7. Light from the image hits your retina and gets processed in your visual cortex. And some neurons are gonna fire when they detect vertical lines, others fire when they see a horizontal line. If both are activated in a certain way, say a long vertical line with a small dash at an angle, you start to recognize it as a 7. It's those neurons firing at the same time that make you know that you're seeing a 7. Over time, with repetition and exposure, your brain strengthens or adjusts the neural pathways associated with those visual patterns. And that's what learning is that repeated co-activation of neurons that wire together into recognizable patterns. If the features of a shape are ambiguous, like for example, if a dash is too short or the angle is unclear, the neurons that trigger a 1 and the ones that trigger a 7 will fire up at a similar intensity. In practical terms, you will momentarily confuse the 7 for a 1, and you learn to label numbers to experience. Someone shows you what 1 and 7 look like, and your brain builds those connections in your lifetime, right? But there also exist patterns, images, smells, and sounds that we already have certain predefined reactions to. Not everything is learned from scratch. And what we specialize in is pattern recognition. So the things we recognize and the things we do that come from learned experience look like tuned connections in our brain. That's what I'm trying to get at. And they develop from experiences, right? Our experiences tune neural networks in our brain to recognize things, patterns, shapes, language, sounds, ideas, animals. That's what we call learning. Whether we're referring to personal human learning or machine learning, they work similarly. But just like we learn from trial and error in our lifetimes, and just like the computer learns by being corrected over mislabeling data sets, we also learn through evolutionary processes. The predisposition our DNA carries over by pre-shaping neural networks in our brain through mutations that result in the trial and error experience of surviving, reproducing, and passing, say, genetics, is effectively similar to a learning process from our environment that's shaped through hundreds of thousands of years of evolution. That's where our nature comes from. So when we say something is instinctive, what we mean is that it's not learned, it's built in, it's hardwired into our nervous system from birth. But how does that happen? It starts with DNA. Our genetic blueprint, our DNA, carries instructions, and those instructions tell our body how to grow, how to build organs, how to form bones, and yes, how to wire a brain. When you're developing in the womb, your DNA guides cells to become neurons. It tells them where to go and, crucially, how to connect. And this matters very much because one of the major obstacles in the human nature denialism is the claim that DNA couldn't possibly have enough information to build something as complex as the human brain. It sounds intuitive at first, right? And after all, the brain has billions of neurons and trillions of connections, but on the other hand, the human genome is just like 3 billion base pairs, so how could that be enough? But here's the thing, DNA doesn't need to store every single detail of the brain's wiring. It doesn't work like a wiring diagram, right? It's like a recipe or a set of developmental instructions. So instead of saying like, connect neuron A to neuron B or things like that, it doesn't do that. It does things like, I'm gonna grow this type of neuron here, and then I'm gonna send axons in this general direction. I'm gonna respond to this chemical signal. Yeah, I'm gonna. So these are rules, right? These are not maps. These are not blueprints. So a simple analogy that we can use is fractals, right? Like fractals are a very short mathematical formulas, and they can create incredibly detailed, beautiful, and complex patterns all the way down to infinity. In the same way, a small amount of genetic code can set off self-organizing processes that result in a richly connected, dynamic brain. And this idea that DNA doesn't have enough storage space just really doesn't hold up. Complexity doesn't require this level of like micromanagement, right? You need certain rules, and those rules evolve through trial and error. DNA doesn't generate thoughts or emotions. It stores instructions for building neural circuits in your brain, and those circuits are what give rise to your instincts. They influence how your brain processes information, making certain reactions like fear or curiosity more automatic. Now let's get into how DNA actually stores instructions for building your brain, specifically the neural networks that give rise to your instincts, emotions, and learned behaviors as well. Your DNA is like a blueprint. It's not a fixed map of what every cell should do. It's more like a recipe that, with the environment, guides the information of circuits in different parts of your brain. But how does that do that? And DNA contains genes, and those genes are basically code for making proteins. Some proteins become part of the neuron itself, like ion channels, receptors, or structural elements. And others are signaling molecules that help neurons grow, migrate, and connect. Some proteins are transcription factors, which regulate other genes, right? Like a gene might say things like, make this receptor that reacts to dopamine, or make this adhesion molecule here so specific neurons know where to stick in the amygdala. This is how neurons get their identity and function, right? And during fetal development, certain genes activate in a specific order, controlling how neural stem cells divide, where neurons migrate in the brain and which ones connect to which. For example, neurons in your visual cortex are guided to form layered circuits that process shapes and movement. Neurons in your amygdala wire themselves into clusters that respond to fear or triggers of aggression, for example. And this is all genetically choreographed. It's like a crew of builders following blueprints based on a larger plan. And even after neurons are in place, DNA still controls how they behave. It affects things like what neurotransmitters a neuron uses, like serotonin or glutamate, how neurotransmitters affect instincts, how sensitive a neuron is to certain signals, right? This means how easily it fires, and how plastic a connection is, right? Meaning how easily it strengthens or weakens, right? This is the plasticity of neural circuits. It's determined by things like protein expression, glutamate receptor types, the connectivity between co-activated regions. All of it shapes how learnable a behavior is. These biological foundations govern the degree to which instinctive responses can be modified later on through experience, right? All of this means that DNA doesn't just build the hardware of your body, it fine-tunes the software, deciding how reactive a system is, how quickly, for example, a baby monkey freezes when it sees movement that it resembles a predator. These processes encoded in DNA are effectively learned information from hundreds of thousands of years of filtered adaptation. In the same way you learn and tune neurons, and in the same way artificial intelligence learns, DNA that directs your instincts is the result of ancient learning processes. This tuning happens through gene expression, how much of a protein is made and when. And for example, someone who's genetically more anxious is going to have more receptors in the amygdala that respond to threat cues and things like this. What's often missed or denied is that our genetics don't just determine things like our height, our intelligence, how much muscle we have, the shape of our bones, the number of limbs we have. They go much further, right? DNA is an incredibly dense storage medium. DNA as a molecule is capable, when engineered, for storing terabytes or even petabytes of information, far surpassing traditional data storage technologies. And part of that information doesn't just define our bodies, it defines how our brains are actually built. Our brains aren't born as blank slates. We don't enter the world completely empty and learn everything from scratch. There are structures, predefined neural circuits already in place when we're born. That's why some things just come naturally to us. And let's take a fascinating example from nature, one that shows just how deeply evolution shapes our instincts. Imagine a monkey in the wild. It's never seen a tiger before, it's never been attacked, never been taught what to fear, but then it sees something. Just the shape of a large predator, maybe a silhouette with sharp ears, forward-facing eyes, or a striped pattern like a tiger. Instantly, the monkey reacts. It freezes, it screams, its heart rate shoots up, its body floods with stress hormones, and it either prepares to run or desperately alert others. All of this happens in less than a second. Over millions of years, species that reacted quickly to predator-like shapes survived more often. They were more likely to escape, to win their group, and by extension to pass on their genes. And the monkeys that didn't react fast enough, well, they were more likely to be eaten. So natural selection favored monkeys with these instincts. And this reaction isn't just in monkeys. You and I have instincts as well. The feeling of unease when you're walking in the woods and you hear a rustle in the leaves, right? The discomfort some people feel around snakes or spiders, even if they've never been bitten. That's your limbic system, specifically your amygdala, programmed, pre-tuned, pre-configured neural structures in your amygdala, responding to patterns. Your brain has been shaped to fear over thousands of generations, hundreds of thousands of years. These are our ancient survival programs, carved deeply into our neural wiring by evolution itself, right? Think about sneezing, right? Let's talk about the simple level things. Talk about sneezing. Nobody teaches us how to sneeze. If we get dust in our nose, we don't just sit there and rationally decide, I should expel this to clear my nasal passage. Let me sneeze. No, the body just does it. That's an instinct, hardwired into us and controlled by our brain. Or think about touching something hot. We don't analyze the situation and think, well, this surface feels hot and heat causes damage, so I should remove my hand. No, your hand jerks back immediately. That's our nervous system reacting way before thought even kicks in, right? These kinds of reactions come from predefined neural pathways, what we call hardwired instincts. And when an instinct is truly hardwired, it means the brain comes equipped with an entire structure dedicated to that function. It's not something you can just unlearn or reprogram through education or cultural exposure. So while not every reaction or behavior is hardwired, many foundational ones are strongly predisposed. That means they can be resistant to change. Not impossible to override in many cases, but very difficult. With intense effort, learning or cultural influence, some deeply embedded instincts can be moderated, but they don't easily just vanish, and they only apply to you. They don't apply to your genetics. So your children are going to have the same instincts, right? For example, our disgust toward feces is rooted in an evolved drive to avoid disease and contamination. It's not something we simply learn, and it's not something we can just unlearn on command. It's an evolutionary safeguard designed to keep us away from disease. So when we talk about human nature, we're talking about a mix of learned behavior and deeply embedded instincts. The deeper ones are built in, right? Let's talk about our most primitive aspect, right? Let's talk about the human reptilian nature, our nature at the reptilian level. What do we share with reptiles, right? Our most basic functions that we share with simple-minded animals such as reptiles are governed by our brainstem. This is what is often colloquially called as our reptilian brain. This is the part of our brain that developed first. Your heart rate, for example, is controlled by the medulla oblongata, and it receives information from pressure sensors in the blood vessels. And if the pressure is too low, it sends signals to the neurons in the medulla to increase heart rate. And if pressure rises, those same neurons lower the heart rate, right? This is all controlled sub-rationally in your brain, subconsciously, right? Breathing too is controlled by your brain by clusters of neurons in the medulla and the pons. And these areas receive sensory input from chemical receptors, right? They monitor carbon dioxide levels, oxygen, acidity in the blood. If carbon dioxide gets too high, neurons in the medulla send signals to the diaphragm, to your mechanical parts, your intercostal muscles, and it increases your breathing rate to expel CO2, to keep this chemical balance in your lungs, right? These are all, there's all of these reflexes, impulses, and mechanisms that are governed by the most primitive parts of your brain, including your heart rate, your breathing, but also things like your gag reflex, vomiting, sneezing, coughing, your sense of balance when you're standing. All of the aforementioned basic survival functions are controlled by our brainstem, colloquially our reptilian brain, because it's the most ancient part we share with reptiles. But now we're going to move on to more complex instincts, emotional, social, and behavioral responses. And this is where the core of what we call human nature really resides, in our mammalian brain, the limbic system. This is the part that governs emotions like fear, affection, and drives like sexual desire, instincts like social hierarchy and territoriality, bonding behaviors, and so on. These are the raw emotional mechanisms behind our expressions, our body language, our gut reactions, and this is where things get controversial. So, mammal nature, let's start with the fear of predators, right? Let's talk about human nature at the mammal level. This is an evolved response. In fact, even monkeys raised in captivity with no experience in the wild will instinctively fear snake-like or tiger-like shapes. Why? Because deep in the amygdala, which is the part of the limbic system that detects threats and triggers fear responses, we have neurons that are highly sensitive to predator-like patterns. The system is designed to react before we even process what we're seeing rationally. It triggers changes in our heart rate, breathing, and even our facial expressions before we consciously register that we are scared. First, the light from the scary shape enters your eyes, where specialized cells start to process basic visual features like lines, contrast, motion. Then information gets sent to the thalamus, a kind of central relay hub in the brain. Now here's the interesting part. The thalamus sends this information to two places. One is the visual cortex, the slow analytical part that helps you consciously understand what we're seeing. But the thalamus also sends a fast shortcut directly to the amygdala, which is part of our limbic system. The amygdala doesn't need a full picture, all it needs is basic pattern information. The curve of fangs, the slit of an eye, the colors and motion, just enough to say that looks like danger. And when the amygdala senses danger, it slams the alarm button. It signals the hypothalamus, which triggers your body's fight or flight response by activating the autonomic nervous system. Chemical messages in your adrenal glands, which releases adrenaline and cortisol into your bloodstream. And adrenaline gives you extra energy to run or fight, and cortisol helps you on high alert for longer. Now let's talk about territorial aggression. This one is a little bit more complex, but still very primal. The hypothalamus, another limbic structure, plays a big role. It regulates aggression, particularly in response to perceived violations of space or dominance. When an animal or a person feels that the territory is being invaded, this part of the brain can trigger aggressive behavior. It sends hormonal signals that prepare the body for confrontation, increases in testosterone, adrenaline, and things like that. We have social hierarchy recognition, and this instinct is especially strong in mammals because we evolved in social groups where understanding rank could mean the difference between survival and being cast out. Similar animals like reptiles don't really have as much of a hierarchical view of their social environment. Here, the anterior cingulate cortex is key. It helps us detect and interpret social signals like dominance, submission, approval, rejection, and so on. And this region lights up when we experience social pain, like being excluded, being embarrassed. And it's also active when we observe someone higher in the hierarchy. It's constantly scanning for cues about where we stand, who's in charge, and how we should behave. These social instincts are automatic and they're very powerful because for most of our evolutionary history, being accepted by the group meant staying alive. So these aren't just random behaviors, they're hardwired into specific neural structures in our brains. They're part of what made us successful species, long before language, civilization, or any of the more human stuff came along. These responses have been with us from the very beginning, and it's pretty simple. If you failed to recognize that a tiger was approaching, or you weren't scared when you should have been, you died. That's it. You didn't survive and you didn't pass on your genes. But if you did survive, your brain was wired to recognize those threat patterns and trigger fear quickly, then your genes had a better chance of continuing. So over generations, the people who were more genetically predisposed to fear certain shapes, motions, or sounds had a selective advantage. That's how evolution shaped our brains. Not just our bodies, but our actual neural circuits. And why does all of this matter, right? Like, there's nothing controversial about saying that we naturally dislike spiders and snakes. We're instinctively afraid of things that resemble predators. We naturally like the faces of babies. We naturally dislike the smell of sulfur, of feces. We naturally like sweet, high-calorie foods because those meant survival, which were very rare in our evolutionary past. There's nothing controversial about saying we breathe naturally, that our hearts beat automatically all through our brain, or that we instinctively know how to read certain facial expressions. These are natural biological facts. So why is human nature still denied? Why is this controversial? Well, let's say you believe we can end violence and create a peaceful, harmonious world. That's a beautiful goal. But it's in conflict with our nature because war and aggression are inherent parts of who we are, especially as men. Women too, but they typically express it differently, right? Men are naturally territorial and competitive. Tribalism is hardwired into us, and with that comes violence. But most people don't want to hear that, especially if they've lived through war, but it's the truth. We are tribal and we are violent, but that doesn't mean we celebrate it. But ignoring it doesn't make it go away. Now let's talk about racism for a second. Nobody wants to be called a racist. I like to judge people by their individual actions, by the content of their character, but the reality is group preference, what we call in-group bias, is natural. Most people gravitate towards others who look like them, even if it's not strictly genetical similarities. That is part of our nature, right? The belief in total equality runs into the same wall. Equality sounds great. Who doesn't want a fair society? But humans are hierarchical. All social animals are. You can organize any organization or society without a hierarchy. It's how things just structure themselves. That's a principle of management type thing, right? Right? That's why the dream of complete equality or anarchy will collapse. Right? If you're a low status man, you might prefer a world where everyone is equal in status. I get that, but nature just doesn't work that way. Myth and religion too, for example, like we think science is going to replace myth with rationality, but we're hardwired to create rituals, to assign meaning, to value the sacred. All of this is part of our psychology too. Some people feel it more than others, but it's always there, even if it varies by personality. And personally, here's one that frustrates me. Social conformity, right? People don't care if something's true. They care if it's socially accepted. If I say 2 + 2 is 4, I know that's true because I've tested it and I'm confident that that is true. But if institutions pressure everyone to believe falsehood, then they will act like the truth is weird or offensive. People will abandon the truth to avoid ostracism, and exclusion is part of our lives' strives, right? For most of human history, social exclusion meant death. Being cast out of the tribe was fatal. So people conform, even if it means denying obvious facts. That's human nature too. Now let's talk about greed and sharing, right? Like, we like the idea of generosity. And in small groups, we're naturally generous people. Within families or tight-knit tribes, sharing is built into our instinct. I share food with my brother, you share tools with me. I share my TV with my children, with my parents. And it works because we trust each other, but once the group grows too large, beyond Dunbar's number, the 120 to 150 people range, those instincts start to break down. That's not your problem, unless you create an ideology like communism, or you deny human nature and expect people not to act economically within their self-interest. You can't expect people really to feel genuine altruism for total strangers. They won't. That's not a moral failure, it's not how we are. Now we're getting to the big one, sexual instincts. Men and women have very different biological strategies. Women are hypergamous, they seek the highest status man available. That's not wrong or evil, it's their nature. That's how they are. If you're a low status man that preaches individualism and free choice though, it suddenly becomes a massive problem because women are not going to choose you. Not even the low status one. They choose the top guy every time they can, and if they can't, they'll still look for ways to get his genetics. And for men, we like young women. Always have across every culture. That's biological, it's not social construction. It's what we like. We not boss women, not secure and success, not fertile, youthful, beautiful women with facial symmetry and balanced proportions that signal healthy genetics. That's what men like. Wide hips that signal healthy space in her pelvic cavity to breed offspring without complications. That's what men are drawn to. There's nothing wrong with that. As long as women understand that that's how we are, and they marry young. But if you lie to them and tell them that they're going to be like men and delay families, right? Thinking that being like men makes them attractive, that's a lie. It doesn't work. Societies that deny this suffer. Just look around. Divorce is everywhere. Families are collapsing. See, the denial of human nature isn't always explicit, but it is very much embedded deep into the way people act and think. They don't expect it. It's hard. It's harsh edge and reaction. So when it happens, it hits pretty hard. So this is the danger in denying human nature. For more detailed implications, you can watch my other videos on the topic, such as A Conflict of Visions, where I discuss the implications of a utopian idea crafted in a misaligned way from the way human nature inherently works. The bottom line is this, right? You can't override instinct with ideology, at least not in the slow evolutionary periods of tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of years. And you're certainly not gonna sustain a civilization for more than a few generations on falsehood, because even if you successfully condition people to believe something unnatural to a large extent, you still have to go out of your way to brainwash every single generation because their instincts and DNA have not changed.